Welcome everyone to the Science and Society Network seminar. My name's Emma Koval. I'm Professor of Anthropology at Deakin University and the co-convener of the Deakin Science and Society Network. And I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the place where I am right now, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and the traditional owners of all the places where you are joining us from today. So this is one of our regular seminars that we have. This one is online. But we also do hybrid seminars sometimes at our Deakin downtown in the heart of Melbourne City. But today we are being joined by a wonderful guest from the University of Edinburgh, Jane Calvert, which I will introduce in a moment. Um, you are seeing us on YouTube, and please do engage in the chat. You'll see the YouTube chat is there. Karina Traits, our wonderful administrator, is there on the chat. I know Associate Professor Tim Neal, one of our SSN stream leaders, is also there. So please introduce yourself on the chat, say hello. And when feel free to put in questions as we go along. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentations today. So do put them in, and Karina will be passing them on to us, and I can ask Jane those questions. Also, just before we start, if you haven't connected with us on the socials, we're on LinkedIn and we're on BlueSky. So please do connect with us on those platforms if you hang out there. And also, if you don't get our regular newsletter, our monthly newsletter, which gives you the rundown of all the exciting SSN events that are happening, and also just wider events about and opportunities related to interdisciplinary research and science and technology studies, please do check out our website. I'm sure Karina will be popping that into the YouTube chat, and at the bottom of the page of our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. So I'm really excited to be having Jane come and talk to us today about her new book. So I'll introduce Jane in 1 second, and then after Jane's talk, we will have discussant comments from Radhika Gorur, who and we also had a second discussant, Ellen Sundstrom Hurden from Stockholm University. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us, so Radhika will be taking on the discussant load for both of them. And then we will have, as I said, plenty of time for questions. So just to let you know about Radhika, Radhika Gorur is the Professor of Education at Deakin University. Her research spans education policy and reform, global aid and development in education, data infrastructures and data cultures, accountability and governance, large-scale comparisons, and the sociology of knowledge. And she's interested in the social and political lives of data and how policies get mobilised, stabilised, circulated, and challenged. She's the founding director of the Laboratory of International Assessment Studies. She has been just recently convener and now deputy convener of the Deakin Science and Society Network. And she's also a founding member of the International Studies Network, which is STS in education. So after Jane's talk, Radhika will be offering her comments and also having a bit of a facilitated conversation. And then I'll come back on to take some questions, to relay some questions to Jane. So to get to our speaker of the day, the woman of the hour, Jane Calvert works in the area of the sociology of the life sciences, and she focuses on attempts to engineer living things in the emerging field of synthetic biology. So Jane has worked on many interdisciplinary collaborations, and she comes to those collaborations from the fields of sociology and anthropology of science, philosophy of biology, and science policy. Her background is from the human sciences, so the social sciences, and also she's done a master's in the history and philosophy of science from the London School of Economics. And her doctoral work was at the University of Sussex in the Science Policy Research Unit. And she's worked for some time at the University of Exeter in one of the ESRC Centres for Genomics in Society, or eGenis. And she's been, though, at the University of Edinburgh for quite some time now, 15 years or so, or more. So her work, it's at the overlap of the engineering of living things, interdisciplinary collaborations, and science and technology study and science policy. So her work that she'll be highlighting today is her recent book that just came out last year. And is wonderfully an open access book, which is really, really exciting. And it'd be probably good to hear about that process itself, maybe in the questions, which draws on her long history of working for 15 years with scientists in the fields of synthetic biology. So this book is it's a very creative approach. It's really accessible to many, many audiences, and I think will really open people's eyes to what science and technology studies can be, what it is, and maybe its limitations as well. So I think on that note, I will pass over to you, Jane, to tell us all about this wonderful book, A Place for Science and Technology Studies.
Right. Can you hear me? Sorry, can I could
Yes,
someone
100%. We
yes.
can hear you and see you. Perfect.
Excellent, good. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma, for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having me here. It's really exciting to be presenting to this audience because of Deakin's importance in the field of science and technology studies. And also it's great to be talking to the Science and Society Network because interdisciplinary collaboration, its challenges, its opportunities, its labours and its joys is kind of really the topic of my book, and I think hopefully it resonates with the work that you do in the Science and Society Network. So as Emma mentioned, I'm going to talk about my book today, which is open access, so it's free, and I didn't actually expect that it would be open access, so we can come back to that later, as you said, Emma. But so it is, as the title of the book indicates, it is a book about science and technology studies. And when I describe STS to people outside the field, I say it's about applying the insights and sensibilities of the social sciences and humanities to science and technology themselves. And as Emma outlined, I see myself as operating from the perspectives of the sociology and anthropology of science, mainly, but to a lesser extent, the philosophy of science and science policy. But I must admit, I've spent quite a large proportion of my career trying to work out what it is to do STS, because unlike in more established fields, there isn't a clear path laid out for you. So one of the ways I've tried to address this question is by asking, where does STS belong? And this work is based, as Emma mentioned, on my long engagement in the field of synthetic biology. And synthetic biology has taken me to a huge number of different spaces, including the laboratory, the classroom, the conference room, the coffee room, the art studio, the bioethics building, the policy room, and the ivory tower, asking what is it to do STS in all these different spaces. Also, the thing about my experiences in synthetic biology is that they have been rather exciting. So they've taken me to all these spaces I never imagined that I would go to before. But also, a lot of it has been really incredibly uncomfortable. And so I'm highlighting these feelings of thrill and discomfort because I think they're methodologically important, and I'll come back to them later. Another thing about my engagements in synthetic biology is that I have got my hands dirty. I've become very involved in the field. And I like this quotation from the STS researcher Viba Biker, who says, STSs can contribute to making things, to changing the world. In doing so, they inevitably will dirty their hands, for there is no free ride here. And the thing is, I haven't just been involved in kind of observation of synthetic biology from a distant perspective, but also in intervention into the field and collaboration with it. And although there is quite a lot of discussion of observation in the STS literature, there's less discussion of intervention and collaboration and what it really means to do these. Instead, discussion in STS tends to talk about the two strands. So the academic strand, which plays close attention to scientific practice, and the activist strand, which kind of often is told as emerging from the 1960s concerns about the social nature of science and its impacts, particularly around things like nuclear power and environmental pollution. But like many people, I've always been dissatisfied by this kind of bifurcation. Like Lucy Suchman, an STS researcher, my aim is to combine theoretically informed scholarly analysis with critical transformative interventions within techno-scientific worlds. But how to do this and how to make sense of it. And so this is why I decided to use the idea of rooms. Because the thing about rooms is that there's a discipline about them. Rooms are spaces, but they are named spaces with particular functions. So rooms constrain what you can do. There are certain things that you can do in a bathroom that you can't do in a conference room, for example. But they also enable certain types of interactions. So just getting into a room, or getting into a policy room, for example, or getting your foot in the door can enable you to make certain types of intervention into that room. Rooms also have specific rules of interaction. So the historian Stephen Shapin famously talked about the rules of gentlemanly deportment, which were kind of the norm in the rooms where experiments were carried out in 17th century England. Rooms are also places where power and control are exercised, because once you are in a room, your perspective changes, which may be a reason not to enter that room at all. This raises questions about whether it's possible to challenge dominant frames from within a room. So whether you can pull down the walls on top of yourself, or if you have to be outside to knock down the building. In other words, do we need distance to critique? So thinking very simply about what a room is, it's a space inside a building. It has a walls, floor, and a ceiling, and a means of entering and exiting. But there's another definition of the word a room, which you'll know, which is opportunity, scope, or opening for something by which it is rendered possible. So I want to draw on both these meanings of the word room today. So what I'm going to do in the time that I have is I'm going to go through a speedy tour of the different rooms that I've been involved in synthetic biology and explore the opportunities for observation, intervention, and collaboration in each of those. So that's the plan. The room I'm going to start with is the laboratory. So laboratories are very significant for science and technology studies. because they're a key site for investigating the production of scientific knowledge. In fact, it was laboratory studies in the 1970s and 80s which really defined STS as a field, because rather than relying on second-hand accounts of what scientists did, STS researchers went to the laboratories themselves to see what was happening. The thing about a laboratory is that it's a protected space that belongs to the scientists. And if you want to get into a laboratory, you have to enter as a visitor or as a guest. And to briefly talk about the laboratory, I need to say something about the field of synthetic biology. And this is basically and simply an attempt to apply engineering principles to living systems. And one of the reasons I remain fascinated by synthetic biology is it's because this is something that these living systems often resist. So my most extended laboratory study was around something called the Synthetic Yeast Project, which actually had a branch happening in Australia, in Macquarie University. And this is an attempt to make an entirely synthetic version of the genome of the yeast species Saccharomyces cerevisiae to make it more manipulable and amenable to human control. So when I went to the synthetic yeast lab, what did I find? I found what you find in most science labs. I found early career researchers in insecure employment who were grappling with experiments that didn't always work as planned. And it was these PhD students and postdocs whose work I followed, and I was really grateful for their patience and dependent on their generosity. And I depended on their hospitality for my time in the laboratory. But something else I found in the lab, not surprisingly, was yeast, because it was a synthetic yeast lab. But slightly more surprisingly, I found a real affection and enthusiasm for the yeast. So the scientists talked about how great it was to work with, how much they loved the way it smelled. And I saw the scientists observing the yeast with affection and attentive care. So this brings me to my first of my kind of orientations, which is observation. And observation can be defined as the careful watching and noting of an object or phenomenon. In fact, attentive care is one of the definitions of the Latin root of observation. So what I tried to do in the laboratory is I tried to observe the early career researchers in a way similar to how they observed the yeast, in a kind of non-objectifying manner. However, I do think there are some problems with observation because of the distance it can impose between the observer and the observed. And Christine Hine talks about how laboratory studies renders a very conventional notion of ethnography to be the appropriate methodology for studying science. And other feminist commentators have talked about how observation is often associated with domination and mastery and the masculine gaze, so it is not unproblematic. So to wrap up the laboratory, because I'm going to go through all these rooms pretty quickly, I think this is a place that provides excellent opportunities to learn about the scientific research. But I think it kind of imposes an observational orientation. So there are reasons to move beyond it. It houses a narrow range of people with similar interests, and it's not a place where you can study broader social, political, and economic forces that shape the scientific research. So I think other places provide greater opportunities for collaboration and intervention. And I'm going to move on to these other places now, starting with the classroom. So I'm talking about the university classroom here, but I'm not just talking about any university classroom. I'm talking about specific circumstances in which STS researchers teach scientists and engineers, because this is something that many of us spend the majority of our time doing. And the classroom is incredibly important in the history of STS, because it's often the reason why STS departments exist at all. To give the example from Edinburgh, the Science Studies unit, which led to the department that I now work in, was founded in 1966 by the geneticist C.H. Waddington. And like other radical scientists of the time, he thought it was really important that science education included culture and politics. So he set up the Science Studies unit, and he told the director of the unit, David Edge, we'll teach them the science, you teach them the rest. So that was their remit. However, the people in the Science Studies unit at Edinburgh did something slightly different. They saw how scientific knowledge itself could be the focus of social scientific inquiry, and they developed pioneering work into the sociology of scientific knowledge. And this is a great picture of the members of the Science Studies unit from the 1980s. But I sometimes think that I kind of do what more directly what Waddington asked for, although this is to some extent a topic of concern for me, which is I kind of teach the rest, maybe. And I have been teaching a course called Social Dimensions of Systems and Synthetic Biology for over 10 years now. And interestingly, I actually teach it in the Waddington building on campus, bringing a nice circularity to things. So another teaching opportunity I've had in synthetic biology is rather unusual, and it's involved around a large undergraduate competition called the International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition, where thousands of students gather to compete to build genetically engineered machines, and they all have to include some element of human practices in their work. So what type of orientation is appropriate in the classroom? And I know that Radhika and others have huge amounts of expertise in thinking about education, so I'd be interested in your views on this. But for me, I think the ideal orientation in the classroom is collaboration. It involves interdisciplinary interactions across different worldviews. And one of the reasons I think this is really important is because, like Callard and Fitzgerald, I think that interdisciplinarity can be a way of perturbing the existing order of the world. So I think this really shows the kind of potential of interdisciplinary teaching. But like I said, there is a danger, I think, of kind of teaching the rest, of just being regarded as a kind of tack on to the more important work of teaching the science. And the early members of the Science Studies unit managed to avoid this service role by developing work on the sociology of scientific knowledge. But I think this service role and avoiding it is something that we really have to actively try to resist in teaching scientists and engineers. The next room I'm going to go to is the conference room. And obviously all academics go to conferences, but STS researchers, when they go to scientific and engineering conferences, will often use them as places for empirical research. And so the conference room isn't much discussed as a location for research in STS, but when it is, it's quite straightforwardly portrayed as a place for observation. And I think this is less problematic than it is in the laboratory in theory, because in a conference, the speakers expect to be watched and they can choose what to present. Conference rooms are interestingly the types of places that Charles Taylor calls topical common spaces. And this is where people gather together for a particular purpose, like a sporting event or a play. They are physically and temporally simultaneous experiences, and certain rules of behavior kind of dictate them. Friendliness and gregarious is kind of normal. They're not completely public spaces, but they're not completely closed either. So to get into a conference, you can either have an invitation or you can pay the fee to attend. But the thing about the conference rooms I attended in synthetic biology is that they were primarily sites for the privileged, dominated by financial and political power often. So the highest level of involvement I've had in a conference room was in a synthetic biology conference that happened in London in 2013, when I was actually invited with my colleague Emma Froh to be on the organising committee. So this meant that rather than just observing the conference from the safety of the auditorium, we could actually actively intervene in the field. So what we managed to do is to integrate perspectives from the social sciences, policy and bioethics into almost all the sessions, which is quite unusual for a scientific conference. We even managed to secure the STS researcher Viba Biker as one of our plenary speakers. And it was really exciting to see a huge room full of synthetic biologists being told about the social construction of the bicycle, which is the topic that Viba Biker is famous for. But however, despite my close involvement in this conference, this was actually one of my most disappointing experiences in synthetic biology. Despite the efforts of Emma and myself to diversify the program, it was dominated by powerful industrial, political, and scientific voices putting forward a kind of very narrow, technocentric vision of the future of synthetic biology that it had been precisely our intention to challenge. So I ended up concluding that perhaps the conference room was not my space, this particular conference room. And this leads me to questions of domestication, because I sometimes worry that myself and my STS colleagues who have worked closely in synthetic biology over the years have become an example of the domestication of critique, that we have kind of appeared, we have put forward critical comments, but in a sense they are kind of safe critical comments, and that our presence in these events has excluded more radical voices, such as those of civil society organisations and NGOs. And so this leads to questions about the relationship between critical distance and intervention, and whether if you want to intervene, if you want to get involved in the conference programme, you have to get too close to a field to an extent. So this goes back to the issue again about whether you have to be outside the room to expose assumptions and show that things could be different. The next room I'm going to go to is a much more relaxing space, and this is the coffee room, although this is actually not a picture of a coffee room, it's a picture of a pub. And this is because I'm treating the coffee room and the pub as kind of similar, because they are both social spaces for informal interaction. And these are opportunities for relationships to be built and topics of shared interest to be identified away from the demands for kind of immediate deliverables or outputs. Spending time in these spaces involves becoming part of a community that cares about the same things. And I would describe my participation in the coffee room and the pub as active participation and shared intellectual exploration rather than detached observation. Spending time in places like this really raises questions of friendship and identity, because who we choose to eat, drink, and socialise with influences who we become. And this is actually tied to the idea of the word companion, which the kind of Latin root of this is with whom one eats bread. So these friendships present methodological challenges because there's no straightforward distinction between the social scientific researcher and the scientific informant. And friendships also involve obligations, concerns, loyalties, hopes, and fears. In other words, they involve affect. But friendships can be really productive if one regards them as collaborations. And if you think of collaboration as thinking with others. And the boundaries are blurred in collaboration. As Diane Forsyth puts it, the collapse roles of participant, observer, critic, employee, and colleague collide. But I think we can also think of collaborations in terms of the idea of epistemic partnership, of thinking as of the people we collaborate with as those with whom we create knowledge. And for me, the most generative form of collaboration are experimental collaborations, and this is a kind of term that has arisen out of recent work in STS and anthropology. And the thing about these collaborations is that they are open to the unexpected. They're not driven by top-down agendas or tied to predefined deliverables. They are uncertain, they are risky, and they may fail, but they have the potential to get everyone to think in new ways. There are downsides to collaboration, of course. You're likely to associate strongly with those you collaborate with. And George Marcus also talks about the problem of complicity in collaboration, of being an accomplice. And this reminds us of another definition of collaboration, which is to cooperate traitorously with the enemy, which takes us very far from the ideal of epistemic partnership. The other thing about collaborations, because they are focused on interpersonal relationships, is that they can overlook powerful structural forces and constraints. So perhaps one can become too comfortable in the coffee room. The next room I'm going to go to is the art studio. And art studios can take a multiplicity of different forms. The reason I became involved in the art studio is because I was part of a project called Synthetic Aesthetics, which aimed to explore what it means to design with living things. And what we did in this project is we paired 6 artisan designers with 6 synthetic biologists from around the world, and tasked them to develop work together. And they spent equal amounts of time in each other's workspaces. So although it's quite normal for artists to go and spend some time in a science lab to be inspired by what's done there, but we actually insisted that the scientists and engineers spent an equal amount of time in the art studio, so the exchanges were reciprocal. And myself and my STS colleague Pablo Schifter originally planned that we would observe and document these exchanges. So this project involved 3 different groups: social scientists, artist designers, and synthetic biologists. And I'd never worked with artisan designers before, but I really found that we had a lot in common. We were interested in opening up synthetic biology to a broader range of perspectives and questioning dominant technological visions of the future of the field. And because we had so much in common, this was quite a kind of revelation to me, because I could conceive myself as being involved in a shared investigation with the artists and designers. And this meant I could shift my position from observer of the paired exchanges to collaborator involved in the co-production of knowledge. But this project didn't just involve social science and art and design. The synthetic biologists were an incredibly important part of the project too. And for me, what was the most important thing about it is that we developed something at the intersection of our different disciplines. And this is something Pablo and I have called an emergent form of critique. And this is an emergent because it couldn't have happened without the interaction. It was also not about one group applying their critical tools to another. It was something that really resulted from the collaboration. And just to give an example of the potential of the art studio, I'll speak briefly about one of the pairings. And this is between Hideo Iwasaki, who's a cyanobacteriologist at Waseda University in Tokyo, and Oren Katz, who's at Symbiotica in Western Australia. And what they decided to do was to use the multiple temporalities of cyanobacteria as inspiration for their project. To explore time as an instrument of humility in synthetic biology. And something we did together is we went to this place, which maybe some of you have been to, which is Lake Clifton in Western Australia. And these round rocks are actually living rocks. They are built by the precipitory activities of cyanobacteria. And the early Earth was covered in these. Cyanobacteria photosynthesize so that were actually responsible for converting the Earth's atmosphere to oxygen and for making all current life possible as we know it. So this is a really kind of massive geological perspective on synthetic biology, which challenged us to expand the very kind of 50-year narrow frames within which synthetic biology is normally considered, by developing an emergent form of critique across our different disciplines. So I think this is also an example of how art studios can open up to spaces beyond themselves. The next room I'm going to go to is the bioethics building, and here I travel back to London. This is the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which is the closest thing that the UK has to a national bioethics body, and it's hosted in this kind of elegant Georgian building in Bloomsbury. So the reason this is a building rather than a room is because it represents autonomous ethical discussion, which is institutionally separated from the science. And this has risks because the danger is that you end up evaluating the science from a distance. But it also has advantages because it avoids the domestication and complicity that can take place in other rooms. So the reason I entered the bioethics building was because I was invited to join a working party on emerging biotechnologies, exploring the ethical implications of these. But the thing is, I am not a bioethicist, despite the fact that scientists and engineers often think I am. I'm an STS researcher. Bioethics is not how I'm trained, and it's not how I approach things. I don't see my role as judging or evaluating the research. And I think it's also important that STS has long criticised the distinctions between facts and values, the scientific and the social, the technical and the political, and the epistemic and the normative, and instead sees them as inherently interconnected. To just give an example of this, in the attempt to kind of apply engineering principles to biological systems, is not just a technical endeavor, it's also a normative one. It says something about the types of worlds that synthetic biologists want to build. But despite kind of rejecting some of these kind of bioethical distinctions, I don't think that STS has no normative principles. And so spending time in the bioethics building really encouraged me to try to think about what these might be. What is it that motivates us as STS researchers? And the answer I came up with was otherwising. And this is something that is found throughout the STS literature. So I'm not trying to say I invented it, but I think it's really important. And I was very happy. I was just looking at a paper of Radhika's from 2019 on STS and education. And Radhika talks about this in really resonant terms. The idea here being that STS shows that things could be otherwise, that they don't have to be the way that they are. And this is kind of grows out of the close study of scientific knowledge and practices that we see in STS. Because once we identify the contingency of our current commitments, we can render them open to change. So just showing that things can be different is, I think, potentially emancipatory, and this is a very powerful angle on the world. So that was my brief excursion to the bioethics building. Um, and otherwising, I realized, is something that I've actually tried to take with me into all the other rooms that I have gone to. And one room I've tried to do this in is the policy room, which is my next room. And here we stay in London, but we go to a much less elegant building, and this is a government department right next to Westminster Abbey. So the policy room and the bioethics building can be both seen as examples of the normative turn in STS, and this can be defined by Lynch and Cole as research that intervenes in public controversies about science and technology. And the policy room, I think, can be a really significant place for STS because it's a place where you can really be influential at the level of research agendas and funding strategies, which strongly influence what comes to be known. So in the policy room, I think intervention is kind of the one of the orientations that we can take. And I understand intervention by contrasting it to collaboration, because while collaboration involves thinking with others, intervention can involve thinking against them, challenging them, or disagreeing with people. As Rebecca Freeth puts it, intervention carries a strong undertone of coming between or interrupting. So there are different ways in which one can intervene in the policy room, and I've been involved in some different policy rooms. For example, I was involved in the Bioscience for Society Strategy Advisory Panel of the BBSRC, one of the UK's funding councils, for 8 years with meetings every 3 months. So this was a very long engagement. But I was involved in the UK Synthetic Biology Roadmap Coordination Group for 4 months with meetings every 2 weeks. So this was a very intensive engagement. But all of the policy rooms I've been in have had a kind of similar vibe. They have been accompanied by sharp suits, big budgets, a sense of urgency, and a proximity to media attention. So a kind of feeling that something important is happening there. So I'm going to talk briefly about my involvement in the UK Synthetic Biology Roadmap Coordination Group. So this was a ministerially appointed committee tasked with producing a report on a short time scale. It involved representatives from business, academia, and government. So I knew about this group, but I wasn't asked to join it until after it had already been meeting for 3 months. So there were problems with joining a group after it had already been established, particularly since it was such a short time frame, because the framing was already set. It became incredibly difficult for me to challenge dominant assumptions in this room, like the deficit model of the public acceptance of technology or the linear model of innovation, which are both kind of models which decades of STS research has shown to be deeply flawed. But it was really impossible to kind of shift those. So I think this shows it's not just about getting into a room, but it's also when you enter a room is important. And the final document that we produced was in many ways incredibly problematic. But maybe my expectations were too high. Brian Wynne has reflected on how he thinks STS should engage with the policy world, but without the expectation of instrumental policy influence, because we cannot predict what consequences our interventions in the policy room will have. Then perhaps it even with this apparent failure, it's still valuable to question what is taken for granted in the policy room, to try to show that things could be otherwise. And also maybe we should take a longer term view of policy engagement, one that extends over decades maybe, and that goes beyond discrete individual policy encounters. There's also the point that we can do policy relevant research without actually having to be in the policy room. And this takes me to my final room that I'm going to talk about today, which is the ivory tower. So the ivory tower is not a real place, of course, but it's a powerful metaphorical one. It has been associated with science since just before the Second World War, but prior to that, it was a place for religious contemplation or artistic sanctuary. But in all its forms, it stands for detachment, separation, and isolation from external demands. And because the ivory tower isn't a real place, I'm going to talk about it in two different ways. The first is the ivory tower as the disciplinary academy, and second, the ivory tower as the library. So the university is the institution we currently associate most strongly with the ivory tower, although universities have of course never been ivory towers. They've always been closely associated with church, state, or market. But universities are sites of disciplinary power, which is why I've called it the disciplinary academy. And this means it's often hard for fields like STS to find a place in them. Another issue is that STS kind of challenges the whole idea of disciplines, I think, because it shows that they're not fixed and change over time. So it maybe doesn't easily fit into these kind of disciplinary structures. And in terms of kind of practicalities, another problem for STS in the disciplinary academy is that many STS researchers are on kind of short-term contracts attached to science and engineering grants. So there are no clear career paths for these embedded STS researchers in the traditional structures of academia. Time and temporality is also an issue in the ivory tower because, as I'm sure many of you know, sustained interdisciplinary engagement takes time, and it takes time away from other things which might have more kind of obvious rewards. There's also the issue of the different temporalities of different fields. So the humanities operate more slowly with books, for example, being the kind of norm as an output. The natural sciences, particularly synthetic biology in my case, operate incredibly quickly with people churning out grants and papers very rapidly, with the social sciences often somewhere in between. And I think this can be particularly an issue for STS researchers because we often try to traverse all three of these, pulled in these different temporal directions. So that's the ivory tower as the disciplinary academy. And now I'll go on to the ivory tower as the library. And this is a picture of a library that I spent quite a long time in. So the library is a space of both spatial and temporal separation because going to the library means making time for a particular type of work. But one cannot ignore the strong connections between financial resources, time, and writing, because to spend extended periods of time in the library, you often need basically a big grant or a sabbatical. As Virginia Woolf put it in her lecture to female undergraduates in 1929, it is necessary to have 500 a year and a room with a lock on the door if you are to write fictional poetry. So, in other words, you need both money and solitude. So to kind of wrap up the ivory tower, I think if we think of it as the disciplinary academy, it's often not a conducive place for STS work. In fact, it's often not a conducive place for many researchers on short-term and precarious contracts. But the library as a place for contemplation and retreat is a more attractive location. But this is where the two understandings of the ivory tower come together, because academic retreat often requires institutional security, which many STS researchers don't have. So I think the ivory tower isn't a real place, but I think we can perhaps think of it as more temporal than spatial. It's somewhere that can provide a temporary refuge, or it can be understood as a phase, a moment in the making of knowledge, something one can go into and out of. And this draws attention to the point that both engagement and disengagement are necessary in collaborative work. So that ends the tour. That is all the rooms that I talk about in my book, given to you very briefly. So this raises the question: well, where does STS belong? Perhaps it doesn't belong anywhere. Perhaps what STS researchers should do is embrace their itinerancy and liminality. So to be itinerant is to move from place to place, and to be liminal is to be on the threshold of a room, simultaneously an insider and an outsider. And one of the most famous liminal figures is Hermes, who is the winged god of boundaries, events, movement, and transformation, who shifts between the realms of gods and mortals, the living and the dead. So there is quite a lot of attraction to me, of becoming a kind of Hermes-like STS figure. But it's not as easy as it sounds, because you might, and I have been regarded as transgressive by betraying the rules of a particular space by moving from space to space. And also moving between multiple sites is necessarily accompanied by a relinquishing of certainty and control, which can be quite destabilizing. But I think if we move around, if we go to different places, we can see that observation, intervention, and collaboration can be appropriate locations in different times and in different places. So to just kind of summarize the different rooms, I have explored how the lab can be a place for observation, although there's a danger here of a separation between the observer and the observed. I think that it's possible to intervene from within the conference room, but there's a danger here of becoming domesticated by spending time in this space. The policy room can also be a place for intervention, but with no kind of control over the outcomes of that intervention necessarily. I've argued that the coffee room and the art studio can be places for collaborations with colleagues and epistemic partners, and that collaboration in the art studio can lead to an emergent form of critique. And if I had to kind of choose between these, I do think that collaboration is the most kind of productive form of engagement, because it does challenge everyone to kind of think in totally new ways. But with collaboration and intervention, there is a danger of getting one's hands dirty. But I do think that by moving around, by spending time in different spaces, it is possible to do research that is in both engaged and autonomous. So those are kind of existing spaces, but do we need a place for STS, a place specifically for the field? And if so, what would it look like? And I've been playing with various ideas, including the idea of a safe harbour. And this could be a place where you kind of learn from colleagues, support each other, share experiences and concerns, and kind of get sustenance to embark on new collaborative voyages. But I think that all spaces, even those with sea views, do restrict and limit as well as enable, so that we should be wary of settling down on the harbour side. And perhaps rather than thinking of a space for STS, we can think about new spaces for collaboration instead, and what they would look like. And so one thing we can do here is try to create spaces for collaboration. So I've tried to hold interdisciplinary workshops in kind of unusual spaces which bring people together in new ways. But I found that these often get taken over by powerful technological visions and voices. So if we do create spaces, we may end up creating spaces that we find uncomfortable. And I've actually thought that some of the most conducive spaces for collaborations are those that I haven't been involved in designing myself, and the coffee room or the pub is kind of an example here. But one that stays with me is Lake Clifton. This is not a room, obviously. It's an outdoor space. It is a place where we were all out of place. But it had no walls. It was open. It led on to other spaces, but it was a real distinctive opportunity for collaboration across disciplines. I think that it provided room in the sense of possibility, and it took us out of our habitual ways of working and interacting. And my final suggestion and my final metaphor is thinking of collaboration as a boat. And boats have a really interesting relationship with place. As Foucault has written, the boat is a floating piece of space, a place without a place, that exists by itself, that is closed in on itself, and at the same time is given over to the infinity of the sea. And I really like this in respect to collaboration, because I think collaborations are similarly bounded and limited because they're based on interpersonal relationships, but they have almost unlimited potential. So whether we think in terms of interdisciplinary workshops or outdoor spaces or boats or something else, I do think that we should embrace the opportunities provided by collaboration, provided by working together, despite its inevitable discomforts. Because thinking with others who think differently from you helps show that things could be otherwise. And this type of work is risky, but I think it's also enriching and hopeful. So that's everything I have to say, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and discussion and input. And thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
That was amazing, Jane. I remember coming across your book, quite accidentally, and then being very immediately excited by it. And then it was just before I was to travel to Edinburgh, and then I got in touch, and it was great. I'm so pleased to have a copy signed by you, with me. I think sometimes a concept just works, and I feel that this idea of rooms, really just works. And so congratulations on kind of finding the right kind of metaphor, which has led to such a generative kind of way to think about science, about STS, about the place for STS. What I found was that I'll just make a couple of quick observations. I want to give enough time to the audience for their questions as well, and I have a lot of questions for you, so I'll just limit my observations to very brief ones. One of the things that I wanted to comment on was just your style of writing, which is so accessible and it is so straightforward, without kind of compromising at all on the complexity of what you're saying, which I think is an absolute gift. The other thing I noticed was that there was so much of literature that was actually referenced, but it was so it felt so in place that you hardly noticed. It didn't kind of interfere with the flow of thought, which is just beautifully done. The other thing was that the cadence of your writing, I think also kind of changed in different rooms when you're talking about different rooms. And that I thought was really very noticeable. To me, it was most noticeable when you talked about the Ivory Tower. And, it seemed to kind of slow down and kind of become very reflective in not only in the words it was saying, but also in the style of writing. I don't know if you realize that, but it certainly came across to me. I found, every room brought important insights, I thought, but I was particularly struck by the bioethics room and the kind of the point that you make about how people think of ethics as something or as something that happens after, or is like an impact of something. Whereas, this is the struggle that we always have, especially when I talk to people in kind of digital technologies and so on, that it happens not downstream, but actually, along the entire kind of all along the stream. And I think that was such an important point to make. I really like the term otherwising. I'll definitely be using it. I think it's such an elegant way of talking about it. Because I'm actually in education, we have a very strong group of people who think that STS has no theory of power, or it doesn't deal with politics, because it's not the usual politics. And I think this is an important thing, that message that to kind of put forward. Okay, so I was also, just the term synthetic. I was thinking about, when you think of synthetic as not natural, that's another kind of way of thinking about synthetic. But of course, synthetic also as a kind of a combination of things, synthesizing something. And I felt that the notions of, particularly the notions of collaboration and intervention, I thought were synthetic in that sense as well, in terms of kind of interwoven or. Yeah, so I have some questions, and I thought we could have a conversation on some of these. First is about the writing. When did the idea of writing up the experiences, into a book start? And did that decision change the way you did your ethnography?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for those lovely and generous comments. It's so weird when you put a book out in the world, you don't really know what people are gonna think of it. And I think because most of the time, partially because of the UK system is quite pushed towards articles, because we have this research excellence framework, the REF, that I hadn't actually written a book before, and I decided with a book that I was just going to write whatever I wanted. I was going to be, I wasn't going to care too much, because I was going to allow myself to be free in a sense which I felt I couldn't do so much in articles, although maybe that's a kind of constraint that is coming from, that is not true. Maybe one can be free in articles too. But I suppose it was really just this ongoing sense of kind of being a bit disconcerted about what it was I was actually doing, and also not really finding in some of the kind of classic STS literature guidance on that. I mean, obviously there is, and that's why I do cite things, because I found obvious people like Brian Wynne and other people have talked about these types of engagement. But being at Edinburgh with the strong programme, Sociology of Scientific Knowledge, Barnes and Bloor didn't really engage in policy contexts. They weren't on bioethics committees, and so I kind of wanted to think about what it meant to do these things, but as an STS researcher, not as to try and be authentic to what STS is, which goes back to the otherwising point, which I said in your article of 2019, you express it so eloquently, and it's like, it's not something that comes from me, it's something that I think is many of us, when we're trying to kind of pull out what is special about STS, that we turn to this otherwising. And I really like the way that you talk about it as being a kind of theory of power, not, because to show that the world doesn't have to be the way that it seems to be, that to show that there is contingency rather than necessity, is just like very powerful. So but I suppose in terms of when it started, literally it took me like a really, really long time to write this book. I'm sure it takes a long time to write any books, but I actually started writing it in 2014, and it was published in 2024, so that's like 10 years. But I didn't spend the whole 10 years writing it. Obviously it was a kind of pet project, so like I say, it was a kind of a side project, for me, a fun project that I didn't feel like that I should be as confined. And some people I got an email from a historian saying, "Oh, I think you were really brave to write in that way," kind of, which was kind of like a double-edged sword thing. And I'm thinking like, oops, maybe he thinks it's not appropriately academic. But I think that we should also challenge the boundaries of what is academic, so that I think we should and we also, I think everyone has to kind of make up what STS is for themselves. So that was my attempt to do that.
Yeah. You mentioned in your book that observation can be a kind of intervention, but it takes time because when you reflect on your observation, etc. And to me, that brought to mind this notion of description, which is, I'm a fan of Latour, and he talks of describe as a way of actually intervening, or as putting out another story into the world or whatever. And I was just wondering about the notion of description and whether what have I written here? Whether it can be an intervention. I struggle with this because I was fine when I was doing this work in the OECD nations, when I was doing my research in the OECD nations. And the minute I went into kind of more starkly global South or majority world contexts, I found that it felt a bit fraudulent to just describe. And you kind of had the instinct to be a little more overtly kind of political or normative, etc. And I just want to get your thoughts on that.
And I mean, definitely. I suppose this is the thing, is that this kind of like neutral observer, of course, there never is one. But for me, that really became impossible. I mean, in some of these policy groups in this roadmap committee, I got very, very angry. I thought people were doing things that were wrong, saying things that were wrong. And so that in that case, it wasn't a question of describing, it was a question of really desperately trying to get my points across, which were then completely ignored. It was like water off a duck's back, a lot of the things that I said. But so I don't know, it depends. I suppose it depends on what we mean by description. But I find like Brian Wynne, as I talked about in respect to the policy room, I find his work on this really kind of helpful because he's an academic who has been very involved in policy context, but he also talks about the value of work that is kind of academic, that is historical, that speaks to our peers, and other people like Pierre Benoit Joly have also spoken about this, that and that can be an intervention nonetheless, that even if we feel that our work is not intervening, it may be intervening in ways that we do not realize or know at the time. It may be picked up later, because also, who are we to know what an intervention is? And this is why this long historical timescale as well is quite appealing and helpful, to see oneself as being involved in a broader project of kind of STS interventions around the world over time, which is kind of often results in apparent failures. But so I think so I think in that sense, that type of description maybe can be an intervention, but it can feel like it isn't at the time, maybe. So I hope that addresses your points.
Thanks. Actually, that kind of leads me to this, because I dwelt a lot on the notion of insider and outsider that you talked about, and it came up again and again in your book, and it's clearly something that you have kind of engaged with, and probably you're uncomfortable with, as a lot of the, a lot of what you write about is actually about the discomfort and the frisson that you feel in these experiences. And you mentioned that the concern expressed by Jasanoff, that about whether being an insider in the lab changes your own perspective. And you talked about circumscribing the imagination, which I think is a beautiful phrase. It's probably Jasanoff's way of putting it. And you also talked about, doing the lab prep. I thought that was a very cute passage, and literally getting your hands dirty, although you had your gloves, purple gloves, if I remember, on.
Yeah.
And then you in the Ivory Tower chapter, you seem to see the Ivory Tower and the library as a retreat that allows one to become an outsider, right? So this kind of so I wondered whether this notion of insider and outsider itself is a manifestation of the circumscribing of the imagination. And does it get dissolved through intervention and collaboration, or does it really get reconfigured in different ways? And I feel that this insider-outsider binary persists, throughout your attempts to dissolve such a binary. Is this fair to say, am I projecting my own discomfort, with the notion of insiders and outsiders, and through that has persisted through my own forays with engaging explicitly with politics through STS?
Yeah, no, that's such a great point that that it might be, yeah, I'll have to, that the insider and outsider might itself be a circumscribing of the imagination, and that yeah, obviously it feels like a kind of dichotomy, and this is why I kind of really I quite like the idea of liminality, particularly when I found out that it actually in Latin referred to the literal brick that goes on the door between rooms, so it seemed to have a really nice, the limen I think it's called, this really nice connection to rooms, but whether one can exist in a state of liminality, or whether one slips into the insider and outsider. But you're right, I think it would be good to think beyond that. And I think for me, it's often a case of shifting allegiances. I've had weird situations where, for example, I was in an art project with an early career synthetic biologist, not the one I talked about here, and a senior artist, and I ended up defending the synthetic biologist because I think I was like, she needs a publication out of this, and she, so rather than and also, I mean, very weirdly, I was well, this is being recorded, isn't it? But anyway, I mean, I was asked to be director of the Centre for Synthetic Biology last year, which I was like approached by five amazing female synthetic biologists who I really admire, and they asked me to be director of the centre, and I was just like, this is so, in terms of insider and outsider, I mean, I turned it down, but that was again this continual challenge to this positioning, but I think you're right that there may be maybe the framing of insider and outsider, maybe we should always be wary about binaries in STS, I suppose, as well. So maybe that is maybe we should think about different ways of framing that, but I'm not entirely sure how at the moment. But I suppose it's always things are always changing and in flux and negotiated, so maybe some more movie kind of metaphors, not metaphors about movement, maybe more valuable here.
Emma's just messaged to say that there are some questions from the audience, but there are two burning questions that I do want to kind of quickly ask you. And maybe we can be brief, and then maybe they'll get reflected in some of the other audience questions as well. One related to, you mentioned Lucy Suchman, and some years back I was in a workshop which she led, which was looking at ethnographies of screen work, because a lot of work now happens on screen. And I wondered whether that was something that you came across in your, you did talk of the lab but it was not, the work was not necessarily happening in the lab. It was largely many times just not attended at all. And I wondered about this screen-based ethnography. And I'll just park that question for a moment and ask the other question as well, which is, you had this wonderful phrase, ontological disobedience, in your book. And I, you talk about the kind of, the self-reflexivity that you have about whether this ought to be okay or not, or what are the dangers of this and what would compromise that, etc., as an STS researcher. And I wondered about the self-destructiveness of STS in this context, and is it self-destructive in some ways? Because I feel not only do we think we should be homeless, because that's and we have to be itinerants to be able to do good work, and that we have to be careful about friendships because we don't want to betray friends, but that we are that the instinct to destabilize and question and to do to kind of focus on the otherwise are things that we apply to STS itself, questioning whether STS itself has offers kind of enough. And this provides ammunition to those who want to kind of, not trust STS or not believe in STS. Do you think this is so? Do you think that we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot with this kind of reflexivity, doing STS on STS? And is observation, intervention, and collaboration a way to overcome that? So I'll just leave you with those questions.
Is it okay for me to answer, Emma? Yep. Yeah, the ethnography of screen work. So that's not. There was a computer scientist in the laboratory that I was in for an extended period of time, but yeah, I'm not. I basically just chatted to her. I didn't spend a lot of time looking over her shoulder. So most of the people I kind of worked with were hands-on wet scientists. But in terms of this question of ontological disobedience and the self-destructiveness of STS, I think this is a really important point. And I suppose it's kind of this frustration about why STS has not institutionalized. It's like STS is so important. Every university in the world should have an STS department. It's so crucial. Every day there are things which make us realize the centrality of the interconnections between technology and power, and but because we continually challenge these assumptions, and we show that things could be otherwise. I don't know, maybe that's the reason why STS has not become institutionalized, but also being institutionalized in itself problematic. But I don't know, but I think I love ontological disobedience. I think it's Steve Woolgard's phrase, actually. It's not mine, but that's what yeah, I think it's so crucially important in being an academic. One should not be obedient, when it's one of the few realms in which we can be disobedient. And so yeah, how you have a collective of disobedient people, I don't know, it's the kind of herding cats thing, isn't it? But yeah, I think that's it. I don't have an answer for that, but yeah, but I do think it is really important. And I suppose this is why I'm trying to think about the safe harbor. So somewhere that is not like institutionalized, which is open, but which still provides companionship and kind of a space for that. So, and I think there are a lot of these safe harbors around the world for STS, but they may not look like departments with kind of tenure track and all those things that we need.
Well,
So
this
I don't have the
maybe
answers.
collaboration on country, and we'll talk about that in due course. So thank you so much for indulging my questions and for being so generous with your answers. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Radhika. And yeah, wow, what a wonderful conversation to witness, and after such a wonderful talk. And really, it was a tour de force, and to be able to take us through your book, through the rooms of your book, so beautifully and succinctly, but yeah, as Radhika was saying, very deeply as well, and raising so many issues really for all knowledge work. And we've got five questions that have come through to me. And I might start with, there's questions about domestication and also about otherwising, and I wondered whether they is that a kind of dialectic in what you're saying? And I'll ask the questions, but I'll also just want to add in my own little take on it. So and I'll ask them together and then you can kind of answer it together. So Adrian at La Trobe University asks about whether you detail the process of critique domestication in your book, and what are the implications. I think that's critiquing domestication, and what does STS specifically offer for this process. And I did think, particularly seeing that image of the doll's house, which is so striking, and is kind of like a very iconic image. And it's cute, it's nice, but also, it's a very feminine image. And also, I don't know, I wonder if anyone was like, oh, doll's house, like it's got a lot of connotations, but it did kind of fit. It made me think, because domestication does come through as something negative in your talk, I suppose. Like domestication is a fear, is a danger for STS. And I suppose, the danger of the whole room idea. But I wondered whether that was one of the normative views of STS that you got us to start to think about, maybe thinking of domestication as something to avoid. But, is it a success to be domesticated? And maybe we should not resist the doll's house as much. Anyway, that was my kind of riff on Adrian's question. But then Sharanya Menon is asking about otherwising, which again I want to ask, is that like the inverse, or the remedy? So Sharanya says she's interested in the idea of otherwising, which Radhika also picked up on. You also propose that just showing things can be different can be potentially emancipatory. And you mentioned the challenges that come up when you tried to do things otherwise. And she's curious about the success stories in doing STS research otherwise.
Oh, such great questions. Yes, success stories. So starting with the domestication, yeah, and I did not think of the doll's house as being a feminine image until now, but you're right, I had a doll's house. My dad made it for me. Yeah, I loved it so much. Anyway, yeah, but and also the negative connotations of domestication. I do talk about the kind of gender orientations of domestication in the Ivory Tower chapter, which actually coincided with the lockdown. So to be trapped in one's home and to be kind of like literally sort of in at home, but this idea that domestication can be a success is really interesting. I suppose I resist it because I felt that yeah, I kind of, like I said, I was at these synthetic biology conferences, being able to speak to many synthetic biologists, and I was suddenly noticed this, that the NGOs were no longer being invited, and that was my worry, was that they were like, oh, we got Jane, she's going to say some challenging things to us, that's fine, and so it was partially about usurping this kind of critical space. Although obviously I do want to be critical, but I'm in a different position from some of the more kind of clearly critical NGOs, I suppose. So maybe that the usurpation rather than domestication is there, but also because I have been accused of selling out on many occasions. I have been written about as a sellout. I mean, it's an anthropologist's issue, which anthropologists have talked about and thought about on many occasions. But that leads one to want to kind of resist it. But then also, I have also had experiences where the synthetic biologists have thought my behaviour was absolutely outrageous and terrible. So where I've really upset and annoyed them. So if you kind of annoy people on both sides who think you're too critical or you're not critical enough, maybe not that the middle is the best place to be, but maybe that's kind of fine. But yeah, this idea of it being a success to be domesticated makes me want to think more about the idea of domestication. I'm also thinking about domesticated animals as well, who are often kind of critiqued for like not being more stupid than those in the wild or whatever, and also thinking about STS in the wild in contrast to domestication, which is something that Calon I think has written about as well. So I think that's a really useful thing to think about. In terms of otherwising and whether it is perhaps the inverse or the remedy of domestication, it's like you have a nice little cat who keeps saying like, no, it could be otherwise, it could be different while it's sitting on your lap or something. I don't know if that works. But yeah, I suppose it's kind of about living with the discomfort. So Radhika had also pointed out how discomfort is a big theme in my book, and being domesticated and trying to otherwise, they are kind of all uncomfortable. But maybe it's kind of living with that discomfort and articulating that. But in terms of success stories, I suppose yeah, I mean there are success stories, but often the successes are short-lived in a sense. So I don't want to give the impression that the book is all doom and gloom and everything's terrible, because I have had yeah, real wonderful experiences. I've had synthetic biologists quoting Haraway at me for infradel heteroglossia in like to me, and in a sense being kind of allowed to open themselves up to these other ways of thinking. I've had Radhika talked about the bioethics and being kind of regarded as someone who's kind of post hoc, and I had a long kind of work with others where we talked about not doing LC, ethical, legal, social issues. We talked about being post LC, and I've been introduced at conferences by synthetic biologists saying, "This is Jane, she's post LC," and being like so proud and like feeling that was an achievement. When we, sorry, I'm going to stop. These are very small success stories, I suppose. But when Viva Biker spoke at this conference, which was to some extent, like I said, my worst experience in synthetic biology, one of the synthetic biologists after the conference tweeted, "Proud to be riding home on my bicycle, knowing it is socially constructive." So I don't know. I feel like these are all like very small success stories, but but there are also kind of things about getting stuff into policy documents, perhaps influencing the way people think. But then, like I said, these can often be short-lived, and it takes constant maintenance to keep things, to keep this kind of critical angle going. If you kind of let it go for things will slip back to the norm, I found. So it's very demanding and ongoing work.
Mm. Oh, fantastic. Yeah. And let's go. There's a couple of questions from Warwick Anderson, who has joined us with everyone else on YouTube. And I think it starts with what I would call as an observation that Hermes is a symbol dominating the University of Sydney, where Warwick Anderson is. There's statues all over campus. But he has two questions. Firstly, where is the field? Many of us do STS outside rooms where issues of hospitality and habitability and thus ethics are different. And I suppose you've talked about that in terms of that incredible landscape in Western Australia. And secondly, what has happened to critique in this schema of observation, intervention, and collaboration? What happens to critique? Then there's an addendum to that the more he thinks about rooms, the less he likes them as analogies. The rooms have walls, barriers, doors for inclusion and exclusion. Doesn't this limit the political scope of being in a room?
Yes, I mean, definitely. I think rooms, I mean, it's a conceit, is a way of structuring the book, but also the rooms, totally, they do have boundaries, they have constraints, they're very limiting in that sense. And that is and this question about the field is totally true, because this is what the late Clifton it kind of made clear to me, is that this was not a room. It did not have walls, did not have a ceiling, didn't have doors. It didn't, it was open. It obviously it was in Australia, so it also has kind of indigenous connections, which are important. But I do thinking outside rooms. I mean, maybe one cannot show that things should be otherwise from within a room. Maybe that is the conclusion. Actually, I'm going to a conference next week, a 50th anniversary of Asilomar conference, which was a conference on recombinant DNA, where I've been asked to hold an event on the beach. Hold a burial on the beach, actually, which is a very long story. To be actually a burial of Asilomar, of the meeting. But this is another opportunity to be outside a room, I suppose, literally, or maybe I'm being too literal about this. But you're right. I mean, maybe just leaving the room altogether is the only thing that one can do. Like I said, I've often tried to create spaces. So this is something that I've done with my colleagues. We've tried to create new rooms, new opportunities, new openings, but often those experiments have been unsuccessful. I mean, we keep trying to do them, but maybe we need to rethink that altogether. But I suppose particularly in Edinburgh, where it's cold, we have to be inside most of the time. So we have to do lots of things within rooms. And also it is obviously a metaphor. I shouldn't take it too literally. Also, yeah, what has happened to critique? So I suppose intervention is critical. It's almost like I said, for me, intervention carries this strong undertone of interrupting, and I wanted to distinguish collaboration from intervention, because they're often treated as the same in STS, but I think intervention is really about wanting to change things, or like I said, for me, getting annoyed and seeing that things would be wrong. But I think that there can be, like I said, this emergent form of critique within collaboration, and I find that really, for me, quite powerful. So within the synthetic aesthetics project I described, we developed the idea that the project and the book we wrote should be a wedge in the door of synthetic biology that should stop it from closing, that should stop it from becoming myopic, from becoming business as usual, from becoming industrialized. And this critique came from the synthetic biologists who were, albeit in the project, so they were already pretty open to these ideas, but it didn't come from that. It came from all of us working together. So I do think that there can be a form of critique, which is not just about me coming along as a critical STS researcher, but harnessing the critique that is there already and that can be found through collaboration. And also, articulating some of the critiques that exist, but that's maybe a synthetic biologist is not in the position to articulate. Because I often find within the field you study, some of the most powerful critiques come from the actors themselves. And so one can actually articulate these. There's often a lot of dissent or discomfort within the field. So I think, critique can exist in this kind of, like I said, this emergent form of critique, and also in the idea of intervention. But then also, this is why I talk about the domestication of critique as well, because I'm concerned about the place of critique. But you're right, I don't have it as one of my three categories of observation, intervention, collaboration.
Wow, that was amazing. We have a couple of other questions which we're not going to get to because we are at time, but Bhavna Rowat and Pat B have some really good questions, and I do encourage both of you to email Jane with your questions. She's going to go and have a bit of a nap because she started at 4 a.m. because you're in Berlin. Is that right?
I'm actually in Edinburgh. I'm in Edinburgh at the
Edinburgh.
moment. Yeah.
Yes, not in Berlin, but in Edinburgh. So then she'll be back at her emails. And we didn't even get to talk about Zoom rooms because that's clearly another whole aspect of collaboration, of a whole aspect of working. And you can hear that my dog is barking in my Zoom room here. But I do want to thank you so much for spending this time with us at such an inconvenient time. But what an amazing way to collaborate and to dwell in your ideas. I do also want to plug a place where there'll be a lot of many different forms of observation, intervention and collaboration, which is OzSTS, which is our national conference for STS in Australasia. So not just national, but also regional, which the abstracts are currently open. It's going to be in July in Melbourne at Deakin, but also at the National Communication Museum, which is just opened. There'll be presentations, workshops, exhibitions and performances, as well as papers and workshopping of papers in progress. So abstracts close on March 14th, and I'm sure Karina and Tim, who are also part of the organisation, will have put the link in the YouTube chat there. Also, we have our next talk coming up in just a couple of weeks by Anne Pollock, which is going to be about pharmaceuticals and sovereign manufacturing in Africa, which is going to be really fantastic with some wonderful discussants. So please come back and join us there. We will be for that one in person, some of us in downtown in the city campus at Deakin, but also please do join us online. And thank you so much, Jane, for being here with us today. And thank you for your beautiful book.
Oh, thank you very much, and thanks for the amazing questions, and thank you very much for Radhika as well for your comments and for making the connection. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Radhika. All right, bye-bye. Bye-bye, YouTube audience. See you next time.
All right.